when the 1.0 product came out and I never touched it again. So I've got this brand new vista of new technologies to learn. It's a bit like 2003 all over again, when I downloaded my first ISO of ESX2 and thought, well, how do I install this? And so you're welcome to join me in my journey. That's another thing that you have to say if you're an evangelist. My journey into the cloud. So before I begin, I've just got a couple of things to do, which is to thank the VMUG leadership for inviting me out here to this event and for the Melbourne event as well. If we have any partners in the room who sell VMware technologies to customers, occasionally you'll come across some of those customers looking at competitive products, such as Microsoft. Sorry, I've been told every time I say that to just but this is an informal offering to those partners who may be in the room. If you are up against some sort of competition thing, you know, SRM versus Zerto, and you're struggling to build a case or an argument for why they would pick one or the other, or you want to know what the competition's going to say about VMware before you get in the room with the customer, come to me. Yeah? Let me be your informal back channel, if that doesn't sound too rude, into VMware competition. I actually work within the competitive team within VMware, which is kind of weird because I don't go around back-mounting with the vendors all the time, which is what some people think competition is. And I'm trying to find a way by which I can use the things I learn within the competition team to get that information out into the community. Sadly, I can't do that for customers because some of that competition information is our IP, and if you're fighting in a team or a competition, the first thing you don't do is give the ball to the opposition. So the reason it's partners only is there's an NDA that you sign as a partner, which makes sure that that information goes into your hands but goes no further. And then the last little bit of, before I begin, last year I wrote a book with fellow V expert Barry Coombs, also in the UK, about end-using computing. I wanted the word end-using computing in the book title, and Barry wanted VMware View. So what we ended up with was a sentence as opposed to a title, but you know, there we are. Building end-using computing solutions with VMware View, which also includes hefty material on ThinApp and ThinApp Factory, and the production version of Horizon Application Manager, which you can download and eval right now. It's not just about VMware technologies, we also cover things like F5's Big IP for load balancing, and we also look at Teradici's Apex cards and the terminals. Yeah. All the money raised from this book gets donated to UNICEF. So far we've raised just over 10,000 US dollars for this international charity. So at the same time of downloading the book or reading a paper copy, you're also helping a very good cause as well. End of advertisement. I should have a copy of the book to be an endorser.
Should have given one away more.
I should have, yeah. What was I thinking? I'm trying to get the book onto the VMware store the VMUG leaders can buy from, but because it's not a VMware press book, I'm struggling to convince them to do it. So the title of this book was, of this presentation is From Zero, having no lab infrastructure at all, to Colo, having a 42U rack with all my kit in it, and how I sort of developed that environment over the last decade, really, and how I've been reshaping that environment with vCloud Directory in its mind. That's where it comes from. But I want to ask just a general question of the room. There was a session even this morning, the Auto Lab, which was a great session. I highly recommend you having a look at it. But why have a lab environment that you play around with? And what's the point? Don't you get enough of IT by going to work each day? That you come home and spend the weekend doing more IT, unpaid? Are you people crazy? Why have a home lab? Why do people do it? Deathly silence. It's not a rhetorical question. I'm genuinely looking for an answer. Education.
It's interesting.
It's interesting.
Proof of concepts.
Testing things before you try them out in the real world or in production.
Not breaking your company's infrastructure.
Not breaking your company's infrastructure.
IT porn.
IT porn. Okay. How about job protection? How about career development? When I was in my 20s, a young man, not the man you see before you today, sadly, this is what 20 years of IT will do to you. If you don't like the way I look and you're looking more young and sprightly, now is the time to get out of the room. Yeah? But I would often do work on the weekends. And this is back in the days when it was like 1993 and I was teaching Windows for work groups, and Lotus 123 to Muppets who didn't know the difference between the spacebar and the shift key. The shift key! No, not the tab key! Ah! See why I didn't last very long doing applications training, but I did it for about a year and a half, but I spent time at home learning new applications that I could then teach, mainly because the company I worked for said if you taught a new course, they'd give us an extra £1,000 on top of our salary. So the incentive was to learn lots of stuff very, very quickly, ideally never teach it again, and then move on to the next product to maximise the revenue. Where I got stuck was when I wanted to learn Novell NetWare, 3.11 and 3.12, because I didn't have a network at home. So I went into the office and played around on the network on a spare box that we had set up with Novell NetWare to learn that. And from that, NT4, and then from that, Citrix, and then from that, this thing called VMware. Ooh, this virtualization thing looks like the thing of the future. Better get on board with that quickly. But my point here is that I think the days of big companies sending you guys on expensive training courses to learn how these technologies are working are sadly coming to an end, if they haven't been already. And the burden of knowing that stuff, learning that stuff, career advancement, I know something that the other guy doesn't come on, it's on your burden now. It's your job to do that. Yeah? You may not like this, but it is a reality. And guess what? It always has been that way. Yeah? Even as a trainer, I never really was very well trained. The training I did was myself, I taught myself, and then I taught others. And I'm still doing that to this day. But my general point is maybe you need to learn vCloud Director, Site Recovery Manager, View, Zen Desktop even. 60% of Zen Desktop environments sit up on vSphere. Why? Well, because the days of just knowing ESX and the days of just knowing Virtual Center, if you think they're going to give you career advancement and job protection, you're deluding yourself. The game is moving on already, and it's time to move with the time before you're forced to move with the time. Yeah? So there's all that kind of fluffy education, trying things out, but how about something a bit more focused about protecting your future career and growing your career, doing something new and different is one reason to do it. Yeah. So I'm going to take you very quickly through the history of my home lab and how it evolved. Then I want to talk about what my vSphere setup is now like, now that I'm learning vCloud Director and how that's sort of changing the way I look at things. And I'm going to give you some hard lessons that I learned by using the product, yeah, which you might regard as me being a bit negative, saying this didn't work. Yeah. But actually it's more a revelation of how I configured something in ignorance and then worked out later, actually that probably wasn't a very smart idea. Guess what, that's how I learned all the vSphere stuff and the Citrix stuff and the Microsoft stuff. Use it, learn from bad mistakes, you pass that on, it becomes part of your DNA. Yeah. And then some thoughts about where I might be going in the future, where we might be going in the future when it comes to things like home labs. So this is very much shaped by me using vCloud Director, and it occurred to me when I was in Hamburg last week that some people might not even know what that is. So I was going off about organisation networks and VM networks, and I was really rocking it. And I thought, what if somebody doesn't know what any of this stuff is? My presentation will sink. So for the uninitiated, a 3-layer model, the physical layer, your hardware, your ESX hosts. Another layer, vSphere layer, you put ESX on that hardware, you create VMs on it. And we're talking about another layer that sits on top, call it cloud, call it the software-defined data center if you must, but some other layer of abstraction which allows you to sort of even further hide the underlying plumbing, as some of my American chums like to talk about it, to make a more consumptive model for the way you create VApps. So I'll move away from the mind just to point out a few things. So we do have what's called a provider VDC that normally points to a cluster, group of ESX hosts. What was new in 5.1 was you can now have a provider VDC that contains many clusters. Yeah. So rather than just being an object that pointed at an object, why have that there? Is it just getting in the way? That object now acts as an aggregator. If you want, you could call it a cluster of clusters. For people who find that 32 ESX hosts in a cluster, each with a terabyte of memory, is just not enough for what they want to do. Yeah. So it's obviously angled at quite large providers if that's the scalability of a single cluster is not enough. The organisation VDC allows you to carve out from that very large cluster a smaller virtual data center, yeah, which tenants use in that environment. All organisations have some sort of org network. Looks like a real network that you can plug into, but it's all in software. And that can either just be insulated, isolated, like a test and dev environment, if you like, or it can be connected to your wider corporate network, or to your internet to publish stuff to the outside world. How all the networking is done? Through something called network pools. So you can have a pool of VLANs that get created and destroyed as you create VApps, or VXLAN, or VCDNI LANing, if you like. Trying to get away from the VLAN as being the way you segment your network is what's being done here. We don't really have time to talk about in detail all these things, but I just want to give you an idea for some of the names and some of the terminology that's used. So, a long time ago, in a time called 2003, is where my Laverick started with ESX. I downloaded the ESX 2.0 CD-ROM and tried to install it to my Dell Optiplex PC, and it told me to get lost. The only IDE controller that ESX2 recognised was one that would be in an IBM Blade. So, impact on my girlfriend. We weren't living together, so it didn't really matter to her. You'll notice that there's an impact on girlfriend thing all the way through this. So I had to scrap them. And I went out and bought 2 Dell 1650 pizza boxes and a DEC Alpha JBoard as the external storage. And yeah, I'm that nutty, I actually got the SCSI cables to go to this JBoard and managed to get a VM powered up and do vMotion between 2 Pentium 3 boxes with the JBoard as the shared storage. This is my proud achievement. It's like building a telephone network out of paper cuts and bits of string. This sort of kit would have been NT4 cluster kind of era, and I was putting ESX on it in 2003. Girlfriend impact, again, we weren't living together. I used to shut it down, at night time, and I used to shut it down if she came round, because, oddly enough, is quite off-putting when you're trying to be romantic. So for all the guys out there, and for the ladies as well, if you're trying to be romantic, one thing that will put anybody off their stride is the sound of whirring servers. At the VI3 stage, I went out and bought off eBay, factory sealed, not D-rack, but factory sealed, some HP DL385s, the AMD type. And over time, I got the second CPU. I bought dual port NICs, added more memory. I'm still running these boxes in my Colo even to this day. The other thing I did is I drove down to Frimley, the UK HQ for VMware in the UK, and a former VMware employee, Richard Garsagan, sold to me for £500 a Sun storage array with all the cables and all the cards. A Sun storage array, by the way, is just essentially a JBoard with fibre channel connectivity. It doesn't even have RAID controllers or RAID levels on it. So I would use a VMFS extents to take each of the 36 gig drive and prevent a volume to it. If I had a disk failure, I'd lose the entire VMFS volume. To write the very first SRM 1.0 book, I was very fortunately introduced by Mornay van de Volt, who's the PM of SRM, to a chap called Adam Carter, who worked for a small company called Left Hand Networks. And they had one of the very first VSAs, a virtual storage appliance, and I had 2 of them replicating to each other on this storage. I now jokingly said I had one of the first implementations of the software-defined storage, because the storage was stupid and unintelligent Sun storage, and all the intelligence was in the virtual appliances replicating to each other. So it just shows what a visionary I am. I'm doing things decades before anybody that's puts a brand name ago, mainly because I had no resources and I was lumbered with what I had. Impact on girlfriend, pretty poor. At this point we'd moved in, and the kit was in a basement on a series of wooden racks that you could probably get from IKEA. In fact, I think they were from IKEA. She would go out in the morning and then I'd power it all on. It would take me about an hour to get it all up and running. If I powered on the storage too early, the ESX host would boot too early, wouldn't be able to find the data stores, and all the VMs wouldn't power up, because everything was virtual after the ESX host. When she came home, I could just about hear over the din her wagging the key in the door. I would then log out, shut things down, everything down in the environment. Of course, I was actually heating my own basement at this point, So, you know, it was workable. Then something really interesting happened. A man from EMC called Chad Sakic, never heard of him before, and a man called Vaughan Stewart from NetApp was sat either side of me in Vegas at VMworld when I opened my mouth up and said, the real problem I have with trying to do SRM is I don't have any real storage to do replication with. Yeah? So Chad sent me 2 NS120s, that's about 14U worth of equipment, and Vaughan sent me 2 NetApp 2020s, you know, which is about 4U once you've got 2 of them. At this point, I realised I could no longer have all this running in the basement. So I moved to a cheap and cheerful Colo, started off with a half-height rack. As more kit came through from the vendors, went to a full-height rack. Yeah. It was a pretty poor co-location facility that I just found online. Did a postcode search. You know, Colos are us, is how I like to call them. And, but, you know, it was cheap and cheerful. How bad were they? When I arrived at the Colo, the racks have no doors on them, and they're all different. Yeah? It's like we've scooped this up from some sort of fire sale. And the power supplies, not APC PDUs, no, the kind of things that you get from Best Buy or from Argos in the UK, long white gang extensions, gaffer taped to the edge of. So you imagine you know, they've got aircon and fire suppressants. Of course, they have to do that because it's a legal requirement. Well, actually, what they're selling to their customers is just a whole load of shit. Yeah. So when I arrived, I went, "Did you call this a data center?" Right, okay. But, you know, it is what it is. Impact on girlfriend, almost zero, but she used to look at how much the costs were. About £315 or $560 US. It did go up when I went into her. And she said, it's a lot of money you spend on this Colo. I said, I can't make you happy, can I? If the kids at home, you complain about the power bill and the noise, if the kids somewhere else, you say, it costs me too much. And it comes out of my business account, you know. So you always have this debate, can we afford this holiday or do we have the Colo? I said, well, not that poor. We can afford both. So the argument I used to say to her is, the kit, it pays the mortgage on this house. Without the kit, I can't do the work. I can't do the work, I can't make revenues as a freelance instructor. There was an intermediary phase when I had a lot more kit, yeah? And then I combined a home lab that I had and the Pro lab together for the SRM5 book. My prices went up, but I'm in a much better facility called No4, which is in Derby in the UK, if anybody knows where that is in the UK. Cost of this now is up £870 a month. It just went up last week because of the cost of electricity going up to £892. Yeah? This is with the VAT taken off, because I'm still a VAT-registered company, even though I'm an employee with VMware. When I wind up my company, I won't be VAT-registered anymore. It'll be like 1,200 odd, because our VAT is 20% currently in the UK. It's a bit horrendous. But on the plus side, I'm getting married. Yeah? And I'm going to live in Palo Alto this year. So I must have been doing something right all this years, you know. And yes, I am getting married on May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. But you'll be glad to hear I'm not having white stormtroopers as bridesmaids. I couldn't get that past the girlfriend. You know. So that's where I was in the sort of lab environment and how it's grown. The reason I need to tell you that is that you then have to understand how I then changed the configuration for that kind of hardware, so you have an idea of what kit I've got. So my former vSphere sort of setup was very much geared around SRM. I had 2 virtual centres for New Jersey and New York, ESX hosts in both, replication between both. Something like this. I don't know how well this looks from the back of the room, but basically I was mapping the VLANs in one site, New York, to the VLANs in the DR location, and mapping the resource pools for my DB, my mail, my web services to resource pools in the other site. It's not a bad little config, but very often I found I had a very low amount of memory in one cluster and a lot of memory in another, because that other cluster was only waiting for a failover test to happen. So I often felt, I need resources everywhere when I'm doing SRM. And then came what I now call the software-defined data center era, or I used to have folders on my data stores where my ISOs were, you know, ESX2, Virtual Center 1. I now just have a folder that says vCloud Suite 5.1, and everything just gets bumped into that suite. So I'm sort of seeing it as even my folders are sort of recognizing a suite era. So what did I do? This is the stuff I've been doing in the last 6 months. Yeah, this is where it becomes interesting for anybody who wants to follow me. I've got rid of the Windows Virtual Center, and I've got rid of the Windows SQL 2008 box that I had, and I've started to use the virtual appliance for VC. The product manager, technical marketing manager for Virtual Center, a guy called Justin King, who's also a Brit, happens to live in Texas, but he doesn't have a Texas accent, oddly enough, was telling me that the APIs for the appliance are exactly the same as the APIs for Windows. There's no functional difference, except no link load, no role sharing, and no licensing sharing of data, which I think is probably the thing that's blocking most people from using this in production if they've got a multi-virtual center environment. Yeah. It's wonderful. I really love the VCSA. The only thing I would say is if you're a big fan of plugins, as I am, the NetApp VSC, EMC's VSI, and so on, a lot of those plugins are designed for Windows. If you want to carry on using them, you need a Windows instance to install them anyway. The only one that doesn't apply in that way is Dell's integration kit for Equalogics, which is actually a virtual appliance. So it doesn't really give a damn whether it's a VC it speaks to that's Linux or Windows-based. Also, those plugins are often designed around the vSphere client, C# client, not the new web-based client. So if you want to use all the web-based client, you lose some of your functionality there. You can use the vSphere client against the Linux instance if you want to. They look the same. I also decided to use the vCloud Director virtual appliance. Very, very easy to set up. Can I ask anybody here actually installed vCloud Director itself, the piece of software? One person, two people? It's bloody difficult, isn't it? It's a nightmare, yeah? And knowing, because I've been through it once before, I decided, well, let's just cut to the chase. I don't really care how the software is installed. I want to learn what's an organization network, what's a VMUG network, how do I manage the firewall. I just thought, blow that off, I'm just going to use the appliance. Some downside associated with that, it doesn't support multi-cell functionality yet. What they mean by that, I hate this use of the word cell, many vCloud Director servers together clustered by load balancing, which is what you do with any web service nowadays, but we must call it a cell. Yeah. And there's no migration from the vCloud Director appliance to the installable version, so you're kind of lumbered with it. Yeah. And there's no update facility on it either, unlike the Virtual Center Server appliance, which has a nice update tab, which checks VMware to see if there's any version and upgrades it for you automatically, which is lovely in the Virtual Center Server appliance, but doesn't exist in the vCloud Director appliance. Yeah. So if you think your lab on vCloud Director is going to live for a long period of time, and that you will want to upgrade it from vCloud Director 5.1 to 5.1.1 to 5.1.1.1.1.1, yeah, because that's the next release coming from VMware. I'm joking, of course. Yeah. Why is it that we just stick another number at the end of products? Anyway, you might want to go for the installable version one. But download a very good guide, freely available on the internet, that will walk you through your first initial config, because it's not a very nice setup routine. Officially, the vCloud Director appliance is not supported in production environments anyway, so it's really only lab. Yeah? vShield Manager appliance, that's a given. I also, for fun, included the vSphere Replication appliance, and I also included the new vSphere Data Protection appliance. I don't really have any use for these seriously yet, but I thought, blow it, if I'm going down this whole appliance route, I'm getting away from installing bits of software in Windows, so why don't we just jump in with both feet? Yeah. And of course I was able to do this because I just sort of leveled my lab environment when vSphere 5.1 came out. The only thing that really survived from the previous configuration was the ESX hosts that were upgraded from 5 to 5.1. Everything else just was different. Yeah? So I took an opportunity to sort of draw a line in the standard, so let's start from scratch, which admittedly in a production environment you wouldn't be able to do. So there's a lot of unrealism here because I work in a lab environment. One of the questions that I've been finding myself asking myself a lot while I use vCloud Director is the way we do silos and how we silo things in our environment. And I mean, as an example of that, what you tend to find in a lot of people's environments is, let's say you've got two clusters, cluster A and cluster B. I've seen an awful lot of customers, they kind of segregate these into different storage LUNs, and also different networks as well, separate from each other. Yeah. So the cluster, the VMware cluster, has become a kind of silo of its own right, yeah, where a cluster sees a discrete chunk of storage and networks that the other cluster doesn't see. Who does that in this room? Don't be scared, it's okay, you can put your hand up, it's not a bad thing to do, yeah. Another thing I've seen customers do is that they sometimes create what they call a swing LUN, which allows them to move a VM from one cluster onto another cluster where there's no shared storage between them. Anybody do that here at all? A couple of people, yeah? Because if you like, the cluster is a bit of a boundary from a management perspective, but also from a resources perspective. And what I've been asking myself for months really is, do I carry on doing that with vCloud Director? Yeah. The provider VDC now sees more than one cluster, doesn't it? So this process of keeping everything into a box, into a silo of its own, do I carry on doing that? Or do I start doing something totally different? Do I start doing something more like this, where I have maybe multiple clusters, because that's AMD and that's Intel. Yeah? I can't do vMotions from AMD to Intel, can I? Yeah, that's apples and oranges. Yeah. But when it comes to pools of storage, pools of networking, maybe I don't respect those boundaries anymore, and these networks and this storage is available to both clusters. How would vCloud Director work in that way? And I honestly don't know the answer to this. One of the weird thing about being an evangelist is people think you know all the answers, which has to be one of the most stupidest kind of assumption to make, because I said at the beginning of this presentation, I knew nothing about vCloud Director until 6 months ago. So hardly a good definition of a guru who knows absolutely everything, is it? Definition of a guru, one person who's a step ahead of you in the manual. Yeah? That's what I used to always say as an instructor. If you were one page ahead of everybody else in the course, you were okay. If the students were ahead of you, you were in trouble. Yeah? Because they begin to realise how little you actually know. Yeah? So here's a question for the room. Why do we like silos? Why do we hate? Why do we do this in vSphere? What does it get? We must do it for a reason. Yeah? Why do we create clusters where the LUNs are only visible to one set of clusters? There was a couple of people who said they did do it. Why do you do it? I'm just curious to know.
There's limits on the number of paths for a start in a cluster.
Paths, you mean, to the storage?
Yeah.
I think an ESX host now can see up to 256 LUNs. That's per host.
There's a path limit as well.
Talking about isolated paths.
Yeah.
Alright, okay. Fair enough. I'll take that. I didn't know that was true, but I'll take it, yeah.
Political and financial reasons.
Yeah, politics. Some people say security as well. If you do PCI transactions, you know what PCI is like, and maybe you set that up into a different domain. You could call it politics, or you could call it security. Sometimes it's the same thing.
Separation of test environments so that everything in the stack is removed from the need for change control.
I think another one is, what if tenant A in cluster A does something very resource intensive? Would that affect other tenants or other people in other clusters? So often it's a performance boundary as well. I mean, you could call it scalability if you're just looking at the same coin from different perspectives. But it's the same principle, isn't it? What I think is really interesting about this is, here we are, a VMware event, yeah, and we extol the values of virtualization, but we're still segmenting things by hardware an awful lot of time. So one of the alternative titles I had for this was going to be the hardware-defined data center, as opposed to the software-defined data center, because we're still doing that. What I think is really interesting about that is we should be in the vanguard, allegedly, or VMware should be in the vanguard of challenging that, but guess what? We're doing it, aren't we? So if we want separation for politics, can't we do that with software? Do we have to use hardware to do that? If we want to stop our test environment affecting our production environment, can't we do that with software controls? Must we do it with hardware-based controls? Because if the answer is yes, we have to do it with hardware controls, we're in trouble, aren't we, at VMware? Because we've just staked our claim to software-defined data centers, not hardware-defined data centers. Now I offer this up not as me trying to preach, you know. I'm offering it up as like, we need to think about this. And we need to think about how soft is our software-defined data center going to be? How hard is our hardware data center? What level do you start to feel, whoa, I don't feel comfortable with you showing one run from one cluster to another? Yeah? Those are going to be the real design decisions of the future, I think, not scalability ones or the number of paths. A bigger question about where do we set things. Yeah? What I often say at this point is a lot of people think server virtualization was quite political, you know, getting all those application owners who wanted their own server for SQL to be, you know, virtual. You know what? That was easy. It was easy. What's hard is explaining to the network teams or to the storage teams how you as a server guy need to take what they used to do and put it under some of your domain management. Just asking for VLAN tagging was political enough. Yeah? Just asking for a LUN that was bigger than 32 gigabytes in size was political enough. Never mind saying we want all that software driven in our hands. Yeah? The only time I've been able to try and convince sort of storage and network people that this is a good idea is to say to them this. You know those VMware people? They're really annoying, aren't they? Oh, yeah. Glad you said that. VMware people. They're always asking for more storage and more networks. You know, I'm an intelligent guy. I shouldn't spend all my time provisioning new LUNs and VLANs. Well, actually, I'm a tedious guy. I really love doing that. But anyway, look, we've got this great way where you can get the VMware guy off your back forever. Yeah. All you have to do is create these pools of LUNs, pools of storage that they will carve up and use, and you'll never have to speak to that annoying VMware guy ever again. That's the way I think we're going to have to try and sell it to these people, rather than on benefits. Sell it as, let me get out of your hair, yeah, and let me do what I need to do, and you know I will take responsibility if it all goes horribly wrong. Yeah. So there's the flip side to that coin. So this is. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I'm already overrunning. Is it 12 o'clock lunch yet? Okay, so I've got 10 minutes. I'm just going to take some prescription drugs over here, and suddenly I'm all like buzzy and quick. Get through the presentation faster than anybody's ever had it before. So, I created two clusters, gold and silver. The AMD boxes that I've got are HP ones, but I bought for Home Lab when I cleared out of the Colo. That was part of the story I didn't really tell you about because they're tedious. Are Intel based. So what was interesting about that was, you know, people go, well, you know, what will be gold? What will be silver? What will be bronze? Well, guess what? Very often, what the kit you have already will dictate that. A bit of EVC, I think, here would go a long way. So if you've got a range of different Intel servers and enabling EVC, you could then at least line them up through EVC without having them in a separate cluster. But for me, that wasn't an option. No amount of EVC is going to tell an AMD processor how to understand an Intel instruction. Yes? The AMD processor is going to look at this and go, and it's going to crash. It's going to panic. Yeah? So I blasted out my two sites. I created an infrastructure resource pool for all the infrastructure VMs, set the high on shares, reserve a bit of memory, because I actually run my management layer on top of the cluster where my tenants are. This is a stupid thing to do in production. In production, what we'd recommend is a separate management cluster that's on separate ESX hosts, separate from everything else. But you know, if you're in a home lab, or even in my lab, I don't have the resources for a management cluster. If I create a management cluster, that just means less VMs overall. But I can't have my tenants, me, upsetting the very fabric that allows it to be managed. So the difference in the processes dictated the separation, I think is the thing to say. Storage. Now this is an interesting one. I created 4 tiers of storage, platinum, gold, bronze and silver. Yeah, more about it in a bit more detail. What's funny about this is that I initially started off with about 14 different tiers of storage. Yeah? You know, so tier 01 was replicated on Fibre Channel every 5 minutes, and tier 02 was every 20 minutes, and tier 03 was every hour. And after doing like 17 tiers, I began to think, I'm supposed to be making things simpler here, aren't I? I'm supposed to be going to a consumption-based model. you know. And I said to myself, I'm creating this thing called cloud, and what I'm actually creating is something more like a telecoms provider. Who here's changed from one telecoms provider to another recently? Yeah? And you go to the sales rep and you say, what deals can I offer? You say, well, we've got this very simple card that explains all the plans. Yeah? And you take this very long, you know, all the different data plans you can have, and you take that to one of their competitors and you try and match them up to see which one is the better value. It's almost designed to not allow comparison from one vendor to another. But the point is, you as a consumer look at that and go, too complicated. It's making my head bleed. Yeah? So much so that people actually switch from one comms provider to another on a recommendation of friends, because it's too complicated to do it yourself. You know? So I hate Orange. Who are you with? Oh, I'm with Vodafone. How have you found them? All right. Okay. Oh, that's good enough. That's good enough for me. I will move. So you know, what I'm getting at here was I overcomplicated the thing. That was the big thing I learned. So this is what I did. I destroyed all my data stores. Yeah. Except the infrastructure and the software data stores were on my ISOs. That's a real option in a production environment, isn't it? Yeah. Go to my manager, I say, I want to really introduce vCloud Director into our live production environment, and the first thing I need to do is destroy everything. I am the angel of death, I've come to bring you cloud, is what you say to these people. But in a lab environment, you do have that choice. Yeah. I started off with something more complicated, and then I rationalized that. So Platinum is on the NetApps with Fibre Channel, SAS-based and SnapMirror replication every 5 minutes is the highest tier I have. Why did I put FC above my iSCSI? Because I've only got 1 gig to iSCSI, but the Fibre Channel cards are 2 gig. After that, they're the same. It doesn't really matter to me whether it's FC or whether it's iSCSI. Gold, on my Dell Ecologics, iSCSI, SAS, replication again, 1 hour. Silver, on one of the arrays, I use SATA. I made a data store cluster of that. I made 300 gig LUNs, and I thinly provisioned it. So it's like kind of cheapo storage to some degree. You might ask, why did you do the 300 gig? I got that from a recommendation from a colleague of mine called Cormac Hogan. Anybody know Cormac Hogan at all? Yeah, he's a great dude. Irish guy, lives in Cork, used to work for EMC. Now he's at VMware. And he told me something, I still don't know whether this is true, but Cormac told me it, so it must be true. But when LUNs are created on the NetApp, I assumed that the writes would be across all the disks in the aggregate. And he said to me, that's not the case. Actually, you might find some of the volumes are only on a couple of disks and not on the others. And I said to Cormac, does that mean some volumes could be hot and other volumes be cold? And he said, yes. So I said, is this a good use case for data store clusters? He said, oh my, yes, this is. I said, is that the case for the Ecologics as well? He said, no. With the Ecologics, when you create a volume, it writes across all the disks. Yeah, so I went, okay, Cormac, you know storage, I'll accept that. But I was actually looking for a good usage case for data store clusters because that was a new feature in 5.1. But I wanted a good reason to have it, not that I could make one. Woo! You know, a good technical reason for doing it. And at the bottom, I've got Dell, iSCSI, SATA, thinly provisioned, no replication on tier 3 or tier 4. What was interesting about that is the first 2 tiers are SAS. I only had about 2 terabytes on each type of array, but the other arrays that I've got that have normally been replication targets, the SATA ones, had about 8 to 10 terabytes worth of space on. So once one array was being entirely mirrored to another, I had this free space I had no use for. So I thought, well, might as well make that silver and bronze. The next thing I thought is, NetApp versus Dell, can't do replication between them. But vSphere replication can. So why don't I say I offer vSphere replication at a different cycle of replication and sort of make my vSphere replication a kind of entry-level sort of offering compared to my, array-based replication. This is entirely different, this thinking is entirely different from what I had previously, where I had data stores that were mapped to different applications, mainly so SRM could fail over the whole mail system, or SRM could fail over my database system without touching anything else. That worries me, this particular setup. How do I make multi-tenancy DR when I've got more than one tenant sitting on the same LUN? In 2 different clusters. How do I do multi-tenant DR and also ensure performance when I've got people in different clusters, different tenants, consuming those storage at different rates? So my worry here is about how do I manage and monitor the resource consumption, both from a capacity but also from an IOPS perspective as well. Yeah. I used to have my silos, remember that? That gave me that comfort blanket. I decided to get rid of those silos. I still don't know whether I'm doing the right thing here, but I'm going to go with it and see what happens. What I think I've identified is that I need other controls. If I am concerned about performance, maybe I need to look at network I/O controls from VMware. Maybe I need to look at storage I/O controls from VMware. Maybe I need to look at software methods of controlling that access rather than trying to create a tier. Because I could have done something else, couldn't I? Yeah. I could have done this, 2 clusters. Yeah. There's a LUN, number 1, LUN number 2, LUN number 3, LUN number 4. And I could have done the same here, couldn't I? 1, 2, 3, and 4. In other words, I could have done platinum, gold, silver, and bronze for every tenant in my environment, couldn't I? Well, if that's the case, why don't I create a cluster for every single tenant? Why is it okay for my tenants to share CPU and memory? That's okay, you say. But when it comes to storage and networking, oh, suddenly Mike needs to separate and make them into silos a lot right now. But I am thinking about that and thinking, well, is that such a bad thing? Do I need to treat storage and networking like the same as CPU and memory? Can I just so casually treat these resources as if they're all the same when they're not? The way a CPU works or memory works is totally different to storage or networking. Can you see where my confusions are and how I'm still really battling to this day on whether I'm doing the right thing? Yeah. Welcome to my journey. It's a confusing one. Yeah. So I have many storage anxieties which I've already outlined. I think to some degree, not completely, many things like vSphere replication and many things like vVols from VMware will help in that, but we can't really talk about what's coming because we have to deal with what is. Yeah? I'll leave it to other software vendors to talk about what's coming before it's even arrived. I won't mention any names. Yeah? Networking, a little bit more simple of this. I created 2 distributed virtual switches. One handles all my management traffic on 2 separate NICs. One manages all my virtual machine traffic. And they're even patched into different switches as well. I mainly did this to protect myself from doing something stupid, where if I changed a single DVS switch, I could blow everything away by making a change that was not expected. I can keep my management of the system entirely separate from the way I actually dish out VLANs and things like it. Yeah. So I'd say goodbye to the standard switch. Goodbye. Yeah. I always used to struggle with the combo approach of using a combination of standard switches and distributed switches. Anybody here use both standard and distributed switches? I know why you do, because 2 or 3 years ago, everybody in the community, including me, was saying really the hybrid model was the way to go. The problem I've had with that in a home lab environment is you don't have that many NICs. And if you want redundancy in both, you need at least 4 to offer 2 NICs in each one. My life has become a little bit more simpler in 5.1 by me abandoning the standard switch. It means everything is in one place and I don't have this hybrid thing to battle with. And going, oh, I want a NIC over here, but it's now owned by this layer of the networking architecture. Yeah. I think my approach on distributed switches, though, is very similar to a standard switch. You know, standard switch for your management traffic and a standard switch for your storage traffic and so on, and doing segmentation in that particular way is kind of similar. But I am still worried that my provider VPCs share the same NICs. You know, what if I do touch the distributed switch and change something that I could affect all my tenants using it? I try and keep myself within vCloud Director when I'm making any changes and not go round the side and make alterations when I shouldn't. Yeah. A larger question that I've been asking myself for a while is it time to re-examine some of the best practices that we've grown up on in vSphere, like the cluster argument, separate LUNs to each thing, and asking myself, where do these best practices come from? And this is a general question, I think, for the whole of our industry. Do you think best practices are forged in the white heat of customers using the product in the real world, and through a kind of Darwinian sort of evolutionary process, a best practice is found? Or do you think best practices evolve out of beta programs where people find things don't work as they should, and then they work a best practice around it because they can't get the bug fixes into that particular software cycle? Or do best practices exist because of a known limitation in a product? like a provider VDC can only have one cluster, which then in a single product release changes. A provider VDC now supports multiple clusters. Slipped that in, didn't we, without really advertising it too loudly. Does that mean the best practice alters? I think it's the latter. I think best practices really come shaped from limitations in the product, limitations in your environment, the politics I couldn't overcome, the security guy who got out his joke and said, we can't do that, it's not secure. Yeah. Somebody looked at the configuration maximums and said, well, you know, if this thing gets bigger and bigger and bigger, we'll run out of whatever it is that we're running out of. Is that where the best practices really come from? I think they do, don't they? But I think it's our job to constantly challenge those best practices as software alters, and not trying to think that it, you know, will stay fixed. Lessons learned. When thinking about a provider VDC, think about all the resources: CPU, memory, disk, network. Think about it as a collective whole. What does that cluster offer? Is that cluster gold? Is that cluster silver? Yeah. My gold cluster supports no FT because the processors are too old to support vLockstep. So I had to compromise. It says a feature called VMware FT is less important to me than the more memory and the fiber channel cards that are in those boxes. Beware of VXLAN. It's assumed that you have VXLAN already set up before you even start doing anything with vCloud Director. If you don't, you'll get a whole bunch of error messages. The error messages are largely benign, but it's nice to have green ticks rather than red ticks when you're first using a product. Yeah. Watch out with VMs already on the cluster. When you go to enable vCloud Director on a cluster, it tries to install the vCloud Director agent. It does this by putting every single host in the cluster into maintenance mode almost simultaneously. What do you think happens? Maintenance mode stays at 2%, because without a target to move that workload to somewhere else, maintenance mode never completes. Yeah? If I had a management cluster, I would never have seen that. So it's interesting, based on what you're limited by, you see things that maybe people who wrote the product never even thought of. You know? It's not the end of the world. Some fail, some succeed. You right-click the ones that fail and say, have another go. And by then, there are enough hosts in the clusters for the move to be successful. Yeah. More lessons learned. Get your VLAN sorted out before you do anything with VCD. And this is especially a warning to anybody who works in a home lab, where very often we don't use VLANing at all, we use a single flat switch. A lot of the features in vCloud Director assume that you've got a good VLAN infrastructure in place, and a flat network with no VLANs is an absolute nightmare. One, almost said the word, feature of vCloud Director is if you set up a network in vCloud Director pointing at a port group that says VLAN 11, and then you go away and you change the VLAN to VLAN 20, and you change the port group on the distributed switch to be 20, vCloud Director will also 20, but it will still think it's 11. Yeah? The reference to the old VLAN ID gets stuck in the database, and there's two ways to get rid of it. Either delete the network and start again, or hack the actual database to correct the VLAN ID in the database. I chose to delete. But you now realise why it's so important to think about your VLAN structure, especially in a home lab where it's much more fluid. I guess if you're doing this production, you would already have VLANs in place, and maybe that would be the first step you did. Talk to the network guys. Yeah. People are going like this. I have to go quick now. Even more drugs. Work out your IPs as well. I've got a network that was essentially based on 192.168.3.x. Why? Because my Wi-Fi router at home also used 192.168.3, and I thought that was a great IP range. Everything's going to sit on that. Because in this multi-layered environment where you have external networks that take you out to the corporate LAN, onto the internet, organization networks for the tenant, even VAP networks for the guy who wants to work in his little sandbox, it makes more sense to, and I know this is a bit old school, say that the external network is going to use a Class A range, the B network, the organization network will use B, and the VAP guy in his own little bubble of a couple of EMs is going to use C. So you get 10, 172 and so on. My screen grabs and some of my pings look really weird as 192 goes into 172 and then reaches another 192 address. It just looks a bit barking mad. Something I want to change, but I haven't got down to it. IP ranges can be tricky to change. You might notice in this screen grab, although everything is powered off, I'm not allowed to change the router or the subnet mask. In fact, the only way to correct this would be to delete the network or edit the database directly. Now, why does VMware do this? I don't really know, but I'm kind of guessing it's to stop the administrator making casual admin changes that could have catastrophic effects. So, you know, it's not normally the case in a physical environment we go around changing router IDs, yeah, without really telling anybody. Oh, you know, well, the router was 5.1, but we'd give it a different IP address today because we just felt like it. So I think it's there to protect you, but it's also something that as an admin you go, I'm the administrator, I should be able to do whatever I like, even if it does disconnect thousands of people from their environment, yeah? So the argument about how much VMware should wrap you up in a cotton wool blanket and protect you from doing stupid stuff, how much you should be free to do anything you like is, I think, a bit moot. Yeah? VApp networks and edge gateways. When you power on a VM, it creates a VApp. When you power off the VApp, it deletes the firewall and the router associated with it. Therefore, if you encode any static routes, they're gone and wrong as well, because the next time it powers up, maybe it gets a different IP address. So if you're doing any work with static IP addresses a lot, remember to tick off the box that says keep my IP ranges. When the VApp is powered off, the edge gateway doesn't get deleted. When you power it back on, it keeps the same IP address. I sometimes think this should be a default. Yeah? So keep rather than throw away. Establish a meaningful convention. Do you recognise this guy here with an egg in his mouth? That's when somebody tries to teach grandma how to suck eggs. I don't know whether that translates to down under, but it's a popular phrase in the UK and also in the US, I think, where you try and teach somebody the absolute obvious they should know already. Yeah? But you'd be surprised how many people just don't do this. So when you lecture it, it like feels like, yeah, you mean connection, and then people just go off and type in random bits of text. But if you look at my screen grab, apologies for the people at the back, this path ping is showing me the entire route of one VM to another VM through its VApp network, across its organization network, into the organization network of the destination, into its VApp network until it reaches the end. And it's showing me all the IP addresses. I also populate my DNS tables with these, so you can actually see the true flow of the traffic. Therefore, when it doesn't arrive at the destination, you know how far it's getting. Maybe that's the place you should troubleshoot, not the place it actually passed just okay. I know this sounds really obvious, but I didn't do it in my own lab environment initially. I'm going to realise I've done a really stupid thing. I should have had a better naming convention. Yeah. Another thing to point out, I've got two organisations, Corp HQ and this thing called COIG, Corp Overseas Investment Group. I've got like a fictitious company that I do everything in. So I can now see which organisation is communicating to it, rather than a bunch of IP addresses. Yeah? I don't know, maybe you're a strange individual who remembers all the IP addresses, all the IP ranges of every single job that you've ever had. Yeah? Yeah, scary people. OVFs, Open Virtual Machine Format. Are they as portable as people like to think they are? Here's me trying to take an OVF that was made in vSphere 5.1, vCloud Director 5.1, trying to import it into a vSphere 4.1, vCloud Director 1.5 environment. OVFs are portable, but even OVFs do not break the rules of virtual machine hardware levels. So I had a virtual machine hardware level 9 that I'm trying to run on a system that has no idea what 9 is. It can only count as far as 7 and 8. Yeah? I think this is really important for anybody who wants to move their VMs to the public cloud. Well, you're not going to get very far if your VMs are based on something that's newer than the vCloud provider. Yeah? One of the things I'd really like to see on the VMware Cloud website is being able to sort, not just by region, the different providers, but what version of the product they're using. So I don't spend all my time building a relationship with a vCloud partner to find that they're on the version that's 18 months or 2 years old. Yeah. When you create a provider VDC, you set what hardware level is. I can set hardware level 9 because I'm using ESX 5.1 and vCloud Director 5.1 as well. Your lab, what are you going to do? A couple of options. You could do something like the Auto Lab that you heard about today. A big beefy box, lots of memory, lots of CPU, and you run all your VMs on it, even ESX hosts. Yeah? And use the kind of fusion out-of-the-box kind of functionality. Here's an idea that I'm working on at the moment called vInception, running vCloud Director inside vCloud Director inside vCloud Director. Yeah? It's, you know the movie Inception, where there's a dream, inside a dream, inside a dream? you're meant to pick a token or something if you're in that film to remind you it's just a dream. So for fun, I decided I'd pick the silver foil unicorn from Blade Runner. Anybody's Blade Runner fan? So whenever I was in my Inception level 3, I could hold on to the silver foil and go, it's just a VM, it's not real. You know, once I'm nested. But what I'm getting at is the Inception level 0 is physical hosts, everything virtual. Level 1 is vSphere running inside a vCloud Reactor VAC. And level 2 is what's running on level 1. So basically nested stuff. Wouldn't it be interesting if one of the vCloud providers provided this as a home lab style environment? So rather than you having to build it with AutoLab, why not just subscribe to a service where you could get all this running? Wouldn't it be great if VMware ever gets around to releasing the VMTN subscriptions, a licensing subscription model, a bit like TechNet, that when you order your TechNet, it also allows you to sign up with a provider who will give you a discount on that lab environment. Hey, wouldn't it be great if that was included in the VMUG Advantage as well? Wouldn't it be great if it also qualified you for VMware education credits as well? Lab, licenses, user group, education. What a vision, eh? So, right now I'm just trying to work on one of these. All of it is like a bit too much. One of the things I'm going to be doing over the next couple of weeks is building this environment and trying to work out what vCloud providers would have to automate. So everyone in this room could say, I want a lab in the cloud, and it only takes 15 minutes to do it, not 3 hours. So here's a screen grab. I've got ESX1 and ESX2 and the Virtual Center virtual appliance.
No, he's doing great tips now. Don't stop
All right,
now.
you keep going. If you're there's lunch is going to be upstairs, but Mike can keep going. You can see here if you want. But
It's really only two or three slides, and then
You're
I'm
doing
done.
really well. Don't let them stop
I can never really get any of my presentations in. If they gave me 3 hours, I'd be here for 3 hours.
we gave you half an hour. You still...
So, this is something I only did when I was in Hamburg and they were all speaking German. I could follow in the presentations. I was working in my lab environment at the back, and I managed to get this working, took a screen grab it, put it in the PowerPoint, and then presented on it in the session in the afternoon. But 2 ESX hosts with 4 NICs, because that's my standard, yeah. With one of the NICs actually connected directly to my storage network, so I can actually present LUNs and volumes from my NetApp and my EMC directly to the virtual ESX host. And they're VI capable as well. So when I say create a new VM, yeah, it's native to the storage. Yeah? There isn't even a VCNS edge gateway in the way. It speaks down to the VM kernel and off to the storage. The only thing that's between it is another ESX host. Yeah? You could say this is a kind of hybrid mode, because it's not completely virtual, the storage isn't virtual, and the network isn't virtual, because I'm actually speaking to my native network. So there's another idea. Not completely separate, totally virtualized, but somehow a little bit of a bleed in between. It's actually kind of, what I liked about Stephen Foskett's presentation.
Apart from his
Handsome, gorgeous looks and fantastic shoes. Yes, this man has great shoes. Was this idea of the integration points and where the integration matters? And do we have to do everything one way or everything the other way? Can we not use a bit of both? That really appeals to me. So I'm kind of calling it cloud nesting, if you like. So this is vSphere client connected to a virtual center, which is running inside a VM, managing ESX hosts, which are inside a VM, which are being managed in a vCloud environment that's on physical boxes. Yeah? This is when you grab hold of the tin foil. It's just a dream. So why do all this? I think it'd be really nice to be able to spin up lab environments as quickly as this. And we do this already in VMware. The hands-on lab are all virtual. Yeah? The vCell environment used by ICs is our products in a virtual environment that they spin up when they need. Wouldn't it be great if that was in the hands of the community? The trouble is that who will provide that? Will there be a significant margin on market for the providers to step into the play? Yeah. That's why I was very interested in Alistair's presentation today about AutoLab, and I asked the question, is there a commercial use of this? And he said, well, actually, one of the cloud vendors has wanted to take this on, and like, those are the people I want to speak to, you know, try and get buy-in. But the only thing I might say about this is it more expensive to run your lab environment in the cloud on a monthly fee than it is to pay the one-off cost for some very powerful PCs and have it under your desk? And I guess the reason I'm asking this question is I don't know where my future really lies with my lab environment. As I said earlier, I'm leaving the UK Some of my to-do list I've already done. I've turned off my Juniper firewall, and my firewall perimeter is now the vShield Edge from VMware. Yeah? But I'm not going to pack up my 42U rack and get VMware to pay to move my hardware to Palo Alto. Yeah? Can you imagine that? A virtualization company pays to have a physical lab move somewhere else. That would be a bit nutty, wouldn't it? So I've got a couple of ideas. One idea I've got is just to say the first person who turns up with a white van near my Colo will unwrap the kit and then take it all away. That's just to get this thing out of my hair. I don't know what to do with it. One idea I've had is raffling it off to try and raise some money for charity, because I like to do charitable things. What we're currently working on is me donating the kit to the London VMUG, and we're trying to get Colt to agree to let us have a rack for free, yeah, to put all the kit in there for the members of the user group in London to access that lab environment and, you know, do VCP work on it. It's even been suggested that we call it the Mike Laverick Memorial Lab. But I have to say, I'm not dead yet. I'm just leaving the country. Oh, this is luring. And the other question I've got is, when I get to Palo Alto, do I start all over again? Do I try and convince my boss to give me some rack space at Prom A, yeah, in corporate HQ? Do I go up the freeway, the El Camino Real, and get chummy with the Cisco guys and try to explain to them why they really need to give me a full UCS system, fully populated with blades with 256 gigabytes of memory on each blade? Do I go back to a home lab? Yeah? Is it now more viable to do that? Is the work I'm doing really needing all this sort of kit? So I don't really know where I'm going with this. But if you want to follow me, yeah, Mike Laverick is the name, MikeLaverick.com is the website, you can follow my journal. I also run a podcast which is as humorous as this presentation has been. But with that, I think it's time for me to get off the stage. If you want something to eat, go out the door. I'm going that way as well. Maybe we could chat over something to eat. But thank you very much for your time.
Lunch is upstairs, guys.
If there's anything left.
There's anything left. Lame Mike.
If you're hungry,
Lame Mike.
complain to us. Mike Laverick, MikeLaverick.com.
My very low reputation is, as I know
White
things,
told him at 12:01 I went twice here, and he couldn't even anywhere. Yeah.
Oh, it's 4:05.
We went from 10 minutes to go to 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes over, just like that.
How'd you get a gig spending over? Fair enough.
I think so. I've got to write the bloody special.
yeah, and I think
I'll just say, yeah.
I was saying this to the guy in the room before I attended. I went to see
Oh, we're downstairs, so Mike's just finished up his talk.
Keep going, the camera.
So, yeah, we're just heading up now. So